She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on the autumn breeze. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. Hurtling downwards, she saw only dark water below, but in the emptiness there were many eyes gazing up in the sudden shaft of light. They could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled towards them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. She caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downwards. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for long, so they called a council to decide what to do. Loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. And a great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water and agreed to go find some. Loon dove first, but the distance was too far, and after a long while he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help, but the depth and the darkness and the pressures were too great for even the strongest swimmers. Soon only little muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He volunteered to go while the others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone a very, very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative, and before long a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of the muskrat. He had given his life to aid this helpless human. But then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back, and I will hold it." Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, the woman sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, from the little dab of mud on the turtle's back until the whole earth was made, not by Sky Woman alone, but with the gifts of all. And together they formed what we know today as Turtle Island, our home. This story, beautifully braided together by the Indigenous writer Robin Wall Kimmerer, tells an origin story of the world through the culture and spiritual tradition of the First Nations people around the Great Lakes. This story would have been shared generation to generation right here far before any settlers ever arrived. It is an origin story of this land. And in this week that we mark National Indigenous Peoples Day, we tell it so that we all might find inspiration and wisdom in its message of mutual support, sacrificial love, partnership with the natural world, and deep, deep gratitude for life here in this place we all call home. And who amongst us, regardless of creed or spiritual tradition, doesn't seek these things these days? Here in this church that is our spiritual home, we also tell stories passed down generation to generation from our ancestors. We tell the origin story of God bringing order to the waters of chaos. And we tell the story of Jesus, the Christ, the one through whom our faith says creation came into being, but also the one who walked through this world as one of us, vulnerable as any of us, who sacrificed himself for all of us and for all of creation, so that we too might sing and dance our thanksgiving for the sacredness of not just our life, but all life, so that we too might find some solid ground when it feels like we are falling through the darkness, so that we too might find some peace when the storms of life rage around us and within us, and who amongst us, regardless of creed or spiritual tradition, doesn't seek these things these days. On that day, Mark writes in his gospel, when evening had come, Jesus said to his friends, "Let us go across to the other side of the sea." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. Whenever the Bible contains a story about a storm, we should be mindful that our spiritual ancestors were never just writing about a meteorological event. External turmoil always points towards inner turmoil that the characters in the story or the writer of the story or both are facing. In our text today from Mark, we read of Jesus and his disciples getting caught in a storm at sea. Now, the Sea of Galilee is nestled between high hills and narrow valleys that act as wind tunnels, making sudden storms there very common. The men with Jesus that night were experienced fishermen. They knew the lake and their vessel, and they knew exactly how much danger they were in as the storm whipped the waters into a frenzy. This was a true expression of outward chaos, and also an expression of inward chaos, and that sense of helplessness that sets in when we feel swamped, overwhelmed by forces beyond our control. This was obviously happening in real time for the disciples, and it was also happening in the time of Mark as well. Mark was writing his gospel during a period of intense, almost unimaginable upheaval in first century Palestine on or near the year 70 CE, when a Jewish revolt against the Roman imperial occupation rose up, and the empire's might came crashing down, desecrating and destroying the temple in Jerusalem, which from a Jewish point of view desecrated and destroyed the sacred heart of the world. Mark's days were full of fear and grief, where death-dealing forces were raging through all aspects of life like a chaotic storm at sea. Perhaps this sense of fear and grief may feel familiar to us in our own days, where our shared sacred home is being desecrated and destroyed through the double-headed hydra of human greed and apathy, which is resulting in climate change and habitat loss and islands of garbage floating in our seas. The sense of fear and grief may feel familiar today as we are battered by the green water waves of polarization and division, when any attempt at constructive dialogue is too often poisoned with rancor and conspiracy theories and cynicism. In our own days of inequality, unaffordability, addiction, and multiple overlapping mental health crises, we know a thing or two about how death-dealing forces take on all-encompassing, overwhelming forms, just like a storm at sea. But then Jesus stood up and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" A storm in the Bible is never just a meteorological event. External turmoil always points towards inner turmoil, and this becomes clear when we consider how Mark parallels the story of Jesus calming the sea to another story earlier in the gospel where Jesus heals a man with an unclean spirit. You may remember it from a few weeks ago. "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" rages the demon. to when both the unclean spirit and the chaotic sea, Jesus then says in Greek, "Piphamoso," or in English, "be still." Peace, be still. Mark then underscores the narrative link between the two stories by having the onlookers in both stories react almost identically. In Mark 1, the crowd whispers, "What is this?" He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. And in Mark 4, the disciples say to each other, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The message in the gospel is clear. In Christ, the reign of God has come near. It will be met with fierce, overwhelming opposition, as fearsome and destructive as a storm at sea, and yet the death-dealing forces of this world are no match for God, who through Christ exorcises demonic forces, brings order to chaos, and offers peace through faith. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me, Jesus says in John's Gospel. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. Through faith, Jesus offers peace to the heart, and through the heart, peace to the sacred heart of the world. In our days, so often defined by greed and apathy and cynicism, when it seems like we have lost the ability to talk to each other across any line of difference, in these times when death-dealing forces like inequality and racism and climate change take on all-encompassing, overwhelming forms like a storm on the sea, I think a lot. I think a lot about the role of faith and the role of the church. I think a lot about the role of our church and how in these days of fear and chaos, we here might participate in the promise of peace that Christ offers to us and through us for all of creation. If you've been here around Metropolitan a few years, you may recall a service in October of 2021 where we made promises to each other in a covenanting ceremony where I officially became your minister of worship and faith formation. Many of you were here. I remember it. And in that sacred ceremony, there was a special moment when Lynn gave me this jade turtle. She gave me this jade turtle and said these words. Many years ago, a wise congregation member described Metropolitan to a new minister as a piece of antique jade, one of a kind and precious. Today we give you this jade turtle representing this place and all of creation. This place and all of creation. I take these words and this symbol very seriously. And every time I preach from this pulpit, I have this jade turtle here with me as a reminder of the preciousness of this place and our shared responsibilities to this place, and through this place, our responsibilities to all of God's creation. A wonderful thing about jade is that while it is very beautiful, it is also very, very tough. It is resilient by nature and not easily broken by the rough and tumble of life. It can be shaped and carved into useful and beautiful things. Jade doesn't need to be locked away in some display cabinet only to be admired and never handled. It's not just for show, only to be seen from afar and never engaged with. That's not the nature of jade, and it's not the nature of church either. The church, our church, is resilient. It's tough. And it lives into its mission when it is lovingly crafted into something both useful and beautiful, yes, for our sake, but for the sake of all creation as well. The church and creation must be braided together. This is a shared and ongoing responsibility, and so in our humble and faith-filled shaping and crafting of the church to be the force for healing and peace Christ calls it to be, and the world needs it to be. And on this day when we seek to learn from and be in respectful relationship with the first peoples of this land, may we find inspiration and wisdom in the origin story of this land, of Turtle Island, our common home, and its formation through the values of mutual support and loving sacrifice and partnership with the natural world and deep, deep gratitude for life. And who amongst us, regardless of creed or spiritual tradition, doesn't seek these things these days? The church is strong and it is resilient, but not on its own, and never, ever as empire. The church is strong and resilient when it is humble, vulnerable, and in respectful relationship with all people of spirit, when it becomes a place of connection even across lines of difference, when it offers peace to all people, especially in the storms, when the storms of life threaten to swamp life with feelings of fear and grief and cynicism. The church is strong and resilient when we allow ourselves individually and collectively to be lovingly shaped by our Creator into something beautiful for the sake of the world. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. Through faith, Christ brings peace to the heart. And through our hearts, may we offer that peace to heal the sacred heart of the world. Now and always, may this be so. Amen.